The Catholic world has a new pope. After the passing of the popular Pope Francis last month, the conclave of cardinals that gathered in the Vatican just chose a new leader for the Church, the American-born Robert Prevost, who took on the name Leo XIV. Just what kind of a pope he will be and what legacy he will leave behind remains to be seen, but we do know a few things about him already, and among the most central and widely discussed of these facts about him is that he belongs to a religious order, the Order of St. Augustine, or the Augustinians. Now, this has led many, including myself, to ask the question, who are the Augustinians? What are their history and what do they represent? And maybe what can that tell us about what kind of a pope Leo XIV will be? Now, belonging to a religious order as a pope isn't something that is entirely unique in itself, of course. Indeed, Pope Francis himself was a Jesuit, as I'm sure many of you know. And, the Jesuits probably deserve an episode entirely of their own because they're incredibly fascinating. But what's significant about Pope Leo XIV is that he is the first ever Augustinian pope. This is, again, significant. Religious orders are, of course, a prominent and widely known part of Catholic history and practice. We have talked about some of these in our previous episodes on Christianity, such as my episodes on Christian mysticism, in which, of course, they play a very prominent and important role. Essentially, these are communities of men and women who take specific vows and want to live a consecrated life in imitation of Christ. This often involves varying degrees of asceticism, detachment, and isolation from society and the world and other people. Thus, some of these orders are more strictly monastic, such as the Benedictine order, where monks and nuns generally live very cloistered lives in isolation. But others are so-called mendicant orders, where its members do take a vow of poverty and to follow the particular rule of the order, but who generally live and work in urban areas, interacting with the general population through teaching, preaching, and charity. So, for example, mendicant orders technically don't have monks, but rather friars, for example. A monk is someone that is cloistered and lives in isolation away from people. A friar is someone who has taken monastic vows, but lives out among the people, teaching and preaching and, interacting with the world in a much more, interacting with the world much more. These mendicant orders are probably the most famous ones, and perhaps for these reasons, and include the Carmelites, the Order of Friars Minor, or the Franciscans, and the Order of Preachers, also known as the Dominicans. Each of these have famous people associated with them who were part of the order historically. The Carmelites have Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. The Franciscans have, of course, the order's founder, Francis of Assisi. The Dominicans have probably the most celebrated of all Catholic theologians and philosophers, Thomas Aquinas, as well as more controversial figures like Meister Eckhart, and this is just to mention a few. And among these mendicant orders is also the Order of St. Augustine, or the Augustinians. They might not be as prominent or famous as the other ones mentioned so far, but they have certainly been very influential, and especially now that one of them is the new pope. To really understand the origins and characteristics of the Augustinians, we have to travel back far into history to the earliest centuries of Christianity. Indeed, the Augustinians take their name and main inspiration from, you guessed it, St. Augustine. Augustine really needs no introduction at all. He's one of the most famous figures and thinkers in history, especially for the quote-unquote Western world, and is one of the most widely studied philosophers and church fathers ever, right? So I don't really need to say much about him here, but very briefly, Augustine was born in 357 AD in North Africa, specifically wanted to say Algeria. His mother was a Christian and his father a traditional polytheist, and it is the latter tradition that he would follow for the first part of his life, you could say. He was a very inquisitive person and eventually became an intense seeker of truth and knowledge to help him find answers to his big questions in life. For a while, he seems to have become a Manichaean, or at least been inspired by them, the dualistic religious movement founded by the prophet Mani, but soon he abandoned this religious tradition after finding it dissatisfying. He then started studying Neoplatonism, which was a relatively new philosophical school at this time, and while he would eventually reject it for the most part, he does say that it was his Platonism that eventually led him to reconsider and deepen his relationship with Christianity. And even though many admirers of Augustine don't like to admit it, it's very clear also when you read his writings that his Christian theology is infused with Neoplatonism in some significant ways. His formal conversion comes in one of the most famous such episodes in history, when he is in a garden completely distraught, but suddenly hears the voice of a child saying, "Take up and read," after which he would pick up a Bible and read a verse that would turn his life completely around. From that moment, he was a dedicated Christian and would go on to become a bishop and respected leader in the church during his lifetime, but perhaps leave an even greater legacy for history after his death. Indeed, Augustine is maybe the most central and authoritative figure for Western Christianity in general, whose ideas and writings in Latin have served as the basis for much of Catholic tradition. His great works, such as The City of God, and especially his Confessions, the autobiography basically, are some of the most widely read, influential, and canonical pieces of literature in history. Again, this has been an embarrassingly and criminally short introduction to him, but because he is just such an incredibly well-studied figure, it really isn't needed. You can find books and videos about him on YouTube that go through him properly, but that's the basic, that's who Augustine is. In any case, as a Christian bishop and faithful practitioner, he lived his life in imitation of Christ as much as possible, one of simplicity, poverty, and service. And it is believed that he actually composed a rule, the Rule of St. Augustine, that put down in writing his ideas on how to live communally as a Christian in the best way, dealing with monastic living, chastity, poverty, and detachment. Again, as we saw before, each monastic or mendicant order follows such a rule, sometimes being characterized and differentiated precisely by the different rules that they followed. This rule of St. Augustine seems to have been quite popular and influential in the early centuries, but eventually it was overshadowed almost completely by the emergence of new ones that nonetheless were often very much influenced by the rule of Augustine. This is especially true of the rule of St. Benedict, which was followed by the Benedictines and many others, and which was very monastic in nature, focusing on the cloistered life of a monastery in isolation, and which was the primary form of monasticism and Catholic orders for essentially the first millennium of the religion's history. It's only in the High Middle Ages that things start changing. By the 12th and 13th centuries, new powerful religious orders were emerging, ones that had a new approach. Rather than the monastic, cloistered approach of the Benedictines, these new orders turned outward to work in the world through education and charity work. These are the mendicant orders that we mentioned earlier, and one of the most important instigating figures for this movement was, of course, the great Francis of Assisi, the foundational figure of the Franciscan order. And within a short span of time, we see the emergence of the Franciscan order, the Carmelites, and the Dominicans, all of whom would become very important. And it is in this same environment that new things also start to happen in Italy. In the first half of the 13th century, there was an upsurge of people in the region, especially around Tuscany, that lived as hermits, often out in the wilderness, dedicating their life to prayer and solitude. Many of these were, individuals who lived by themselves, but there were also smaller groups who lived together in small communities in this way, and they were made up essentially of lay people. So this was a lay movement for the most part. After a while, in the 1240s, either on the Pope's own instigation or because some of the hermits in this wider movement went to this head of the church to ask for it, anyway, these disparate groups and individuals were brought together. In 1244, Pope Innocent IV officially called for some of these groups to come together to form a new mendicant religious order, and specifically to follow the rule of Augustine. It is at this point, in other words, that the Order of St. Augustine is officially born. But there's also another important date in 1255 when the Pope Alexander IV decided that the order should be expanded by absorbing a bunch of other groups in the region and beyond. This is sometimes referred to as the Grand Union, as opposed to the smaller union that happened 11 years earlier. In other words, by 1255, the Augustinian order, as we know it, was born, and it would stand alongside some of the other mendicant orders at that time as very significant for the history of Christianity, using their way of preaching to spread the religion to different parts of Europe and the world. And indeed, the Augustinians have become famous, among other things, especially for their very strong missionary character. They do a lot of missionary work and have spread to large portions of the world. But this also naturally leads to that question, an expansion of that question, which is, so what is the characteristics of the Augustinian order in particular that sets it apart from these other orders that are, at least to some people, at least a bit more well-known? What is special about the Augustinians? Many of the other orders have very prominent and famous characteristics that we all associate with them. The Franciscans follow in the footsteps of St. Francis, emphasizing things like simplicity, poverty, and service to others. It's a very, quote-unquote, earthy order associated with charity and complete dedication to the welfare of others. This attitude was very much adopted by the late Pope Francis, who chose his papal name, Francis, precisely in reference to this, and his simple way of dressing, him choosing to live in the more humble house of Santa Marta rather than the traditional residence at the Vatican, and the way that his papacy was so heavily focused on the poor and marginalized. This was all in direct connection to him choosing the name Francis, referring to St. Francis of Assisi and the Franciscan order that came after him. Of course, he wasn't a Franciscan himself, but a Jesuit, but still, of course, consciously embodied the character of St. Francis and the order associated with him. Now, the Dominicans are quite different. They are very much the philosophers, quote-unquote, of the Church. Founded by St. Dominic, basically with the express purpose of intellectually meeting the enemies of the Church and heretics, their focus has always been on intellectual pursuits, the study of philosophy, right, and are basically the main representatives of scholastic theology and scholastic philosophy. It's quite telling that Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the most famous Catholic theologian in history, was a Dominican. The Dominicans were often the ones that carried out inquisitions and tried heretics in Europe. They were the inquisitors, mostly the inquisitors of this period were Dominicans, right? So this intellectual scholastic approach is definitely their main characteristics. Now, with that said, we shouldn't draw too clear lines here, of course. The Dominicans were also dedicated to, charity, and, the Franciscans weren't necessarily against study and intellectual learning. But, when we're generalizing, these are definitely characteristics that they are associated with, right? And the Carmelites could perhaps be associated with a deep, contemplative, and sometimes mystic approach, considering figures like Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. Now, the Augustinians, unfortunately, aren't as easy to place in this way. Based on my research, I do have a bit of a hard time highlighting any clear characteristics in the way that we can do with the other orders, but there are, of course, certain things that one can mention. For one thing, the order is, of course, characterized and almost defined by their adoption of the rule of Augustine, which determines their whole way of living and being in the world. But at the same time, this isn't entirely unique to them, as several other orders, including actually the Dominicans, also follow the rule of Augustine. But it does say something about their approach. Compared to other such monastic rules, the rule of Augustine does have an approach that is, let's use the word holistic, right? It includes both contemplative, inward-looking aspects, as well as more active practices aimed at the wider community and humanity. One writer, Dom Turbesi, as quoted by David Gutierrez, says, quote, "Among all the forms of early monasticism, the Augustinian is the one which explicitly emphasizes the union of ascetical life with priestly ministry and, at the same time, the resulting duty of continuing study of sacred learning." In this, St. Augustine was a true innovator, much ahead of his time. His contribution instilled into the institution of monasticism a sense of the pastoral need of the Church. Monasticism was born out of a love for truth, that is, the love of solitude, contemplative life, and personal sanctification. St. Augustine added to it the demands of love, that is, the need of love for the Church, in the sense that she, as a mother who has given birth to many children, cannot accomplish her purpose without having persons who will help her. The Augustinian contribution included also the fundamentals for the renewal of clerical life and customs. In other words, this rule was one that worked perfectly for the new mendicant approach for the medieval orders, and we can see in the historical and contemporary Augustinian order how they are very much embodiments of this. There is, as we saw, a big emphasis on missionary work, as well as a general charity and focus on helping the poor and those in need, but also to strengthen this mission through learning and study. So in this way, they might be seen as a kind of combination of some of the characteristics of the other orders. They have some of the learning and intellectual approach of the Dominicans combined with the charity of the Franciscans. But this is, of course, mostly me just drawing my own conclusions. And this characteristic and approach can actually be corroborated, though, by looking at the official symbol or a seal for the order, which consists of a heart with an arrow through it sitting on a book, thus encompassing all the features that we've just discussed. Of course, it goes without saying that there is also a big emphasis on the figure and teaching of St. Augustine himself. Just in the first week of Pope Leo XIV's papacy, at the time of recording this, he has directly quoted and referred to St. Augustine several times in his addresses. Indeed, in the very first time that he spoke on the balcony of the Vatican that day when he was elected, he right away referred to himself as a son of Augustine, really hammering home this connection. In an aesthetic sense, the order has, of course, a habit of their own. Now, a habit is the clothing that the friars or monks will wear, and each order will have distinctive habits sometimes. So the Franciscans will have, although there are differences in different branches of the Franciscan order, but generally they are associated with this brown, simple habit. The Dominicans usually wear white habits, sometimes with a black sort of cloak over it, but generally the white habit is the main one. And the Augustinians, they have a strikingly black habit, setting them apart from the others. From the time of its official formation in the mid-13th century, the Augustinians have played an important role. Their central place has always basically been in Italy, but through missionary work they have spread to a significant amount of different locations in the world. They can be found all over Europe. They have a significant presence in the Americas, including in the US and places like Peru, of course, where the current Pope has spent so much time of his career. And there are also sizable communities in Asia, in places like the Philippines. Major figures like Giles of Rome have been Augustinians, and even Martin Luther himself was an Augustinian friar before instigating the Reformation. There have been interesting developments within the order over the centuries. In the 16th century, figures like Giles of Viterbo studied Plato and Jewish Kabbalah, incorporating those teachings and traditions into a Christian framework, similar to contemporary figures like Ficino, and in distinction, of course, to the Dominicans, who, for the most part, held fast to the Aristotelian philosophical basis that had dominated this scholastic tradition for centuries. Augustinian thinkers in the early modern period might thus have been instrumental in the revival of Platonic and Hermetic learning, contributing to the Renaissance and later intellectual movements. And indeed, the order will now, of course, get another boost of fame and prominence as the newly appointed Pope Leo XIV is officially the first Augustinian pope in history. It remains to be seen just how that legacy will affect his style and way of leading the Church. If the general history and characteristics of the order is anything to go by, then I think we can expect a pope that definitely follows in the footsteps of Pope Francis in his emphasis on, really emphasizing charity and taking care of the poor and marginalized in society, but maybe also with this added dimension of the strong intellectual, theological tradition that the Augustinians are also so strongly characterized by, right? And I think we can see this in some of the earlier works of who is now Pope Leo XIV. So it's going to be really interesting to see what this means for the coming years of the Church, and it's going to be exciting to follow this and see what happens. I want to congratulate the Catholics out there for the election of your new leader for your church. I hope for especially for everyone else, but for everyone really, I hope this was an interesting, albeit very short and simple introduction to the Order of St. Augustine that the Pope is a member of. It's a fascinating order that has, as we've seen, played a very significant role in the history of the Church. For now, thank you so much for listening. I would like to thank my patrons, as always, for supporting this channel monetarily. I never tire of saying it, but I'm so humble and grateful for all of your support, so thank you so much. You can become a patron by following the link in the description. You can leave a one-time donation through PayPal through the link in the description as well, or through Patreon. You can like the video, you can subscribe to the channel and comment, which also really helps out. If you're interested in following me and my work, you can find me on my socials, on Instagram, on TikTok, all over the place. It's on the screen. It's all also in my link tree in the description. You can find all the things that I'm up to and all my places where I'm active, or at least semi-active. Also, definitely check out my other channel, Philip Holm, which is dedicated to my music, posting my music and content about music. So I would really appreciate it if you wanted to go subscribe to that channel. For now, thank you again, and I will see you next time.